Hello, we're CCL, so we're gonna start right on time. So my name is Jan Storm, and along with the great, impassioned Elise Sparks, I co-lead the CCL Agriculture Action Team. And our goal, basically, is to engage not only all of you, but all of the people that we try to connect through grass tops and grassroots efforts, basically with agricultural stakeholders who are or have the capacity to actually be important allies for us in solving climate. So we have two great speakers to give you an overview of two of the very important parts of agriculture, which have the capacity to help us solve climate. But first I want to tell you, so we have people in the audience that have index cards. So if you don't have a card and someone has said something, you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. They'll give you a card. You can write your question down, and then they'll collect it. So I think just go ahead and do that throughout. And then each of the speakers will talk maybe for 15 or 20 minutes. And then we'll have an open discussion. Also, we have a hard stop, so we do have to get out of here for the next people. My experience has been that often what happens when we stop talking, people rush the stage. And we really don't want that to happen, so maybe we could get Debbie and Jad to kind of step out in that hallway. And if you do have questions and if they have time to stay, I'm volunteering for you guys, you might be able to continue, but please, we got to get out of here at 3:45. So first, I'd like to and I think what I'll do is I'll describe both Debbie Reed and Jad Daley, and then invite Debbie to go ahead and make remarks, and then Jad. And I think it's a little bit interesting how we got such great talent here. I first met Debbie when I actually tried to connect with the National Young Farmers Coalition about 2 or 3 years ago as a newbie CCLer, not really knowing anything about the complexities of agriculture, and I just kind of marched into the policy office down here in Washington and said to them, well, we want you to support carbon fee and dividend. And they said, well, no, and do you really know what you're talking about? And it's complex, and you should really go to the Coalition on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases. And so I did that at the time, and Debbie still is the director of that coalition, which is a fantastic multi-stakeholder coalition of all kinds of private, nonprofit, and government organizations that are working, I guess they say, in this space. So I'm thrilled and grateful that to have her here to talk to us, and she has now recently become executive director of an even, I think, bigger thing, which is the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium, which she'll describe. And I'll stop there. But in my mind, I'll say this: types of partnership in the ESMC are under the category of unlikely partners because it includes private industry, again, as well as people like General Mills, as well as the Nature Conservancy, as well as National Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts. So unlikely partners coming together to help, in my view, solve climate. And then I first met Jad when I also kind of stepped in as somewhat of a newbie giving a presentation at CCL on how to engage farmers in our local communities. And I was merrily talking along about how I was able to talk to our Farm Bureau president and get him to talk to me and all about farming. And after that, Jad, who was in the audience, raised his hand and asked about forests. Have you ever considered the capacity of forests to really solve climate change? And I had no answer, really. So that was a wake-up call. And so the first thing we did was invite JAD, who's the director of American Forests, the oldest conservation organization in the country, to do one of our Agricultural Action Team webinars. Some of you might be familiar with them, but about a year ago, we realized that a lot of CCLers really didn't know the first thing about the agriculture sector. And so we went about getting people that were in the ag sector, just give us webinars and just talk to us. And so they were great. And I really appreciate Jad's graciousness in doing one of those for us. And then about a year and a half ago, I ran into him again at a CAG meeting in which he, along with American Farmland Trust, was providing remarks on a brand new effort under the umbrella of the U.S. Climate Alliance, which brings together both forests and farms in terms of trying to help states in that alliance develop strategies to really maximize the carbon sink potential. So, you know, we're just kind of intersecting. So we're really, really fortunate to have these two people here. And if I can get out of this, I could do escape. And then Debbie puts hers up. That's Jad's. I don't know where yours is. But maybe down here.
Oh. I don't even know how to use touchscreen.
There you are. But it should have already been downloaded. It might be there. No. Okay. Anyway. Oh, I didn't. Oh, I forgot to show my slides. I'm sorry. I was very nervous. So while she's doing this, well,
Yeah.
I think I might be able to do it. No, I can't. Okay.
Did you want to show them?
Yeah,
I can-
quickly.
Put that down. Yeah. Let's see if that's it.
No.
No. Technology.
I know.
Oh, no, I lost the mouse.
Okay. We do want someone to help.
Please. We've lost our mouse,
It's the younger generation is coming.
right? So we seem to have lost the mouse first.
Oh, okay. It's over, I think it's doing an expanded screen, so it's, yeah, it's over on that display. So we have it back
that's
over
okay.
here. Okay, so you're trying to show her slides right now?
Yes.
Okay.
And then stay for getting Debbie's back
Yeah.
up.
Okay, so we'll
Get out of that one.
do, oh. Okay. We're gonna go. Okay.
Okay. So again, this is the Farms and Forest Allies and Climate Solutions. So the three things, this is CCL branded ways of getting things going. Three points I just want to make is that what you all might know or might not know is that photosynthesis really is the original carbon capture technology. It's been proven over millennia to be very efficient at sucking out carbon and using energy from the sun and water to move carbon into biomass and store it above ground and below ground. And amplifying the capacity to do that only helps us amplify the impact of a carbon price. Also, there are analyses, which I think Jad will show, is that in the United States, our forests and farms actually have the capacity to capture about a fifth of the emissions that we emit each year. So when you're talking about trying to meet net zero emissions by 2050, it gets you a fifth of the way there. That's a big deal. And then finally, and this is what Debbie and Jad will be talking about, is that carbon capture and storage by forests and farms is already happening and already expanding. And then I'm just going to say, there they are. And now, Debbie.
Thank you so much. All right. So thank you, Jan. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your help. All right. So I gone too far. So as Jen said, I'm with the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I've been working on ag and climate change since 1997 when I was working in the Senate. And we were debating the Kyoto Protocol, and my boss said, we need to find a way to make the 34 to 38 members of Senate Ag and Senate Ag Appropriations constructively and technically engaged in climate change mitigation. So I've been working on it since then, and I have to say, we have learned a lot in that time. What I want to take time to talk about today are the challenges as well as the opportunities to utilize agriculture for climate change mitigation. The challenges are real, but they're great, and there are great opportunities. And the solutions from agriculture are real, and there are great opportunities. So I want to walk through that as I go through this presentation. So first, I'll start with some of the challenges. Agriculture, as you know, is a source of greenhouse gas emissions, responsible in this country for about 9% of our annual greenhouse gas emissions. That is not mostly CO2, that's mostly methane and nitrous oxide, but also CO2 emissions. I have an asterisk on this slide. That's EPA data from 2017. I have an asterisk because that number does not include the biological sequestration capacity that Jan referred to. So that's what we emit from agriculture, but we are in fact sequestering and reducing some of the greenhouse gas capacity. What we'll talk about today is how to bring down that 9% number, not only through biological sequestration, but by looking at methane and nitrous oxide, which are both very potent greenhouse gases, important to agriculture. So opportunities there. The other challenge is that we are looking at a future in which we're anticipating having 9 to 10 billion people on this planet by 2050. To feed those people, we are going to have to intensify agriculture production. We are not currently keeping up with, if you look at where we need to be by 2050, our ability to feed and produce food, fuel, and fiber for the 9 to 10 billion people on the planet by 2050. We have to increase agricultural productivity. Obviously, we want to do it sustainably, and we want to do it in a way that increases the ecological benefits of agriculture so that we're preserving natural resources as well as improving them, and in particular, greenhouse gases and water, and I'll talk a little bit about that. It is possible to sustainably intensify agriculture. We have to know what we're doing, we have to be able to monitor it, and we have to be able to track it over time. So those are very important issues to think about. Another challenge, of course, is that agriculture is a business done outdoors. We're talking about biological systems that are subject to the vagaries of weather and climate and everything that happens outdoors. That makes it difficult. There are also opportunities, though, to work within those biological systems. The other challenge is that here in the United States, we have 2 million independent operators known as farmers and ranchers who manage their systems differently and on a daily basis, a weekly basis, a monthly basis, right? They have to manage their systems according to what's happening not only outside, but on the marketplace so that they can be economically viable. The other challenge is that we, as society, have demanded economic, safe, abundant food supply. And that is what farmers and ranchers are doing today. They're producing a safe economic food supply that doesn't cost us a lot at the stores. And they're doing it with tools that we developed and gave to them. I worked at the Department of Agriculture for years, at the Agricultural Research Service. There's a significant federal resource that does research to provide the tools to agriculture to do what they're doing. They're using the tools we have provided to them. We are now saying, there are some unanticipated consequences of the tools we have given you. Fertilizer is one of them. It causes nitrous oxide to be produced, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. Sometimes that nitrogen from fertilizer goes into the water supplies and causes significant nutrient loading and problems that cause human health as well as biological impacts to fish and other aquatic species. They're doing that with the tools we provided. We're now saying, we want you to be more transparent about what it is you're doing, and we want you to reduce your greenhouse gas footprint, your energy footprint, your water footprint. We need to give them the tools to do that as well. And there are great opportunities to do that now and to create wholesale change within the agricultural sector by working with the sector, and that's what I want to talk about. Part of the solution, Jen referred to this, soil carbon sequestration. Why is it that we can put soil or carbon into the soils? That's because historically, agriculture and the conversion of natural lands to agricultural uses caused the loss of a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. We're talking 55 gigatons, which is 55,000 million metric tons of carbon went from the soils into the atmosphere when we converted lands into agricultural production. That is an opportunity. We can put a lot of that soil carbon back into, or carbon back into the soils. In the United States, about 1/10 of that comes from U.S. Soil organic carbon loss. Reversing that loss and resequestering that carbon in the soil is a win-win opportunity, because soil organic carbon, not only, if we put that back into the soil, not only will we be causing mitigation of greenhouse gases and helping to reduce the impacts of climate change, but we could, in fact, be improving the soil resource, and I'll talk to that about that a little bit. One important point I want to make, though, is that every time we lose agricultural lands or natural working lands, forested lands, to urban development, other development, we're making the problem harder to solve. In the state of California, as you know, they've had a very progressive climate change policy for many years. They found out very late that it's harder and harder to meet their goals out to 2030 and to 2050 every year because of the conversion of forest lands and ag lands to other purposes. Because as those lands are converted, their emissions go up and it's harder to meet over time. This is a very important policy consideration to stop the loss of these lands. Once we lose that carbon, it's much harder to put back in. It's much more expensive to put back in. That's a very important policy consideration for this crowd to know about. Agriculture as a solution. U.S. cropland, as Jen said, cropland does in fact absorb carbon and is in a state of active absorption of carbon over time. About 8.4 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents per year. The scientific potential, though, is much greater, about 100 million metric tons of carbon per year, if we provide the right tools and resources to the sector, give them the right tools so that they can, in fact, engage in practices that increase soil carbon sequestration. The benefits to society in terms of climate change are real, but to farmers as well. As you increase soil carbon in soils, you get improved soil tilth, which is literally just the feel of soil, the health of soil, the aggregation. Improved fertility and productivity. It actually increases, without additional fertilizer inputs, productivity of soils. That's very important. And so then you can reduce chemical fertilizer inputs. Also, by soils being healthier with the addition of soil carbon, you reduce erosion and nutrient leaching into water, which again causes additional water quality problems. So there's multiple incredible benefits to be gained by increasing soil carbon. Also, because you get the reduced erosion, because you get that better tilth in the soils, agriculture itself becomes more resilient to the impacts of climate change that we're seeing, the increased high precipitation events, the increased incidence of droughts. Soils and agriculture are more able to actually withstand some of those impacts when in fact you increase the organic matter content in the soil carbon. So these are all great wins for agriculture. I do want to say, though, even though we're not talking a lot about this today, nitrous oxide and CH4 methane are also two very potent greenhouse gases. There are significant opportunities working with the sector to reduce these as well. Fertilizer optimization, just ensuring that we're increasing the uptake of plants of fertilizer and other nutrients can reduce their leaching and reduce their emissions in the form of N2O. And we do know some of the practices that can do that. Methane mostly comes from livestock systems, both enteric fermentation and production from livestock itself, belching, farting, as we know, farting cows, everybody thinks that's funny. It's a significant source of greenhouse gases, but also from manure management and then rice production systems. But we know, particularly with manure management and rice production, there are ways to reduce the methane from those systems. The other thing about methane, it's called a short-lived climate pollutant. It actually has a much more potent forcing action as compared to nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide. And 20 to 25% of the current climate forcing that we're seeing is due to methane. So if we can reduce methane in the short term, while we're also reducing carbon and other emissions, we can actually buy ourselves some additional time because of the climate forcing potential of methane. The other thing is that methane creates tropospheric ozone, which is low-level ozone, which has both human and agricultural impacts. It reduces agricultural productivity because of its presence as a low-level ozone precursor. It also is harmful to humans, causes asthma, significant lung and health impairment. So reducing methane is also very important, not just thinking about the sequestration potential. Another challenge is speed, scale, and impact. Time is not on our side right now in terms of climate change mitigation. How do we incentivize changes across the entire agricultural sector in a way that achieves speed, scale, and impact? We have to engage the entire sector, and we have to provide the tools to do it. It also has to be economical. If we enforce something or try to regulate something that is not economical for farmers and ranchers, they might adopt it for a short time. They certainly won't do it for a long time. So we have to make sure we provide the tools and make sure that this is cost effective for them to be effective for us as well. There are policies and programs, USDA and state programs, to incentivize the sorts of practices that help sequester carbon and reduce nitrous oxide and methane. Only 5% of US farmers in any given year participate in these programs. That's not a lot. That's not a lot of scale. We have to continue to support them. We have to increase them. We have to look for other ways. One of the ways that I have been working on, no, I went too far, is to look at this idea of new tools. This slide has both solutions and challenge. Solution is we have new tools, and there are new tools being built. The challenge is there are no silver bullets. I talked about 2 million independent operators, right, all doing this different things. We have to work with farmers and ranchers. We have to work with their buyers, and that's one way to do this. So I talked about federal policies. Jen mentioned the U.S. Climate Alliance. This is really important. This is more than 22 states and Puerto Rico working on Paris level commitments, if you will, in the absence of federal action to try to mitigate greenhouse gases. Jed and I participate on a natural and working lands group that is really helping to bring the forest and the ag solutions to these states so that they can start to build them out within their states and work with their constituencies. The other thing I would mention here is technology. There's significant technology on the horizon right now, both being utilized and that can be utilized to really help us figure out how to measure what's happening from agriculture, not just the greenhouse gases, but other impacts, which will give great feedback mechanisms so we can continue to provide advice, provide tools to agriculture to help mitigate climate, to help increase soil carbon. So I would pay attention a lot to what's happening technologically on the horizon. And then the last thing that I will talk a little bit about is ecosystem service markets. This is something I've been working on for a long time. I would say in the past 20 years, we haven't been able to scale these opportunities for agriculture. The consortium that I'm working with right now, I think has a great opportunity to scale that, and I'll talk about that a little bit. Our intent really is to create the tools, but also incentivize and then recognize farmers and ranchers for not only what they're already doing, but the additional things that they can do. And that's how we can really tap, I think, our collaborators on the ground to help us with these solutions. So the ESMC, as we're known, the mission is to advance soil health systems and the ecological outcomes that benefit society from, through ecosystem service markets. The way we're doing this is we have developed, over the past year, we've developed protocols that help us to quantify, measure, report, and verify changes in soil carbon, net greenhouse gases, water quality, and water quantity use from agricultural production systems. So we have one protocol, and we engage and enroll farmers and walk them through a process, and then provide the tools to measure this so that they can understand at the end of every year what changes their practices have resulted in terms of soil carbon, greenhouse gases, water quality, and water use. It's really, again, trying to provide the tools to make this easier for them and make it cost-effective and efficient. I want to talk just a little bit about where is the demand coming from and where are our collaborators coming from to actually help us make this financially viable for farmers and ranchers. If you're not familiar with corporations that have been establishing obligations and commitments to reduce their energy footprints, their greenhouse gas footprint, their water use, they're known as Scope 1, 2, and 3 inventories. And basically, what corporations have to do annually is report their inventories. Scope 1 and 2 is everything that they're responsible for in terms of greenhouse gas production, energy use, within these 4 walls, for instance, and the energy they put in. And Scope 3 is within their supply chain. So anything they purchase, for instance, from a farmer, General Mills, if they buy oats from a farmer, what are the greenhouse gas impacts of, and the water impacts of growing that oats? Those companies have to account for, on an annual basis, all of those emissions, all of those water impacts, and then try to reduce them. We are working with a lot of these companies to help them meet these needs in a way that is harmonized and compatible across the country. So we're working with the farmers and the ranchers on one side and with companies on the other. Right now, they have annual greenhouse gas reporting commitments, and they need to undertake interventions working with their ag supply chain to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we're helping them to do that. Right now, what is developing is they have to also report water use and water risk, and we're helping them to do that as well within our system. So that's where our demand is coming from. These are our members that are working with us right now. As you can tell, there are a lot of CPG companies, consumer-facing companies, that are trying to reduce their supply chain and their in-house greenhouse gas and water commitments. There's a lot of grain integrators and others in there, NGOs, pretty much across the agricultural supply chain. This is not only where we're getting demand, but where we're getting collaborators on the ground to help us do this. The last thing I would say is what we're doing right now and for the next 3 years is we're working with all of those companies and collaborators to do pilot projects on the ground and to expand across the country so that by 2022, when we launch a national functioning market, we will have pilot tested our protocols and in all major U.S. agricultural production systems in all major regions. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This is an incredible turnout for the, I know the latter stages of this year's conference. Usually it starts getting pretty thin about this point in any conference. And so just really appreciate there's so many folks here and just can see the level of engagement in the room. But I have to tell you, it's no great surprise to me. I tend to think of CCL as about the toughest pound-for-pound fighter in the Act for Climate game. You might know my brother-in-law, Sam Daley Harris, has been very involved in CCL, and I've been on your calls walls. I've been watching the growth and evolution of CCL, and I really feel like you all stepped in at a moment when the climate conversation was tilting in the wrong direction. A lot of people say, well, I guess we're not going to do this. And I feel like you all really stepped in forcefully at the critical moment to say, yes, we are going to do this, and it's just a matter of when. So thank you for everything that you're doing. And so my goal is in this presentation is if all you remember are just the headlines at the bottom of these slides, I'll take that as a win. And what I'd love to do is actually intrigue you enough to want to follow up, because there's a lot of complicated information to really understand the nuances of how forests can help with climate change, how the land sector as a whole can help with climate change. So I just kind of want to frame how you might think about these issues and learn your way into these issues. And I really hope that you'll want to work with my organization, American Forests, the Forest Climate Working Group, which is a coalition that I'll talk about of 50 organizations in the forest sector all working on these issues, but also our really important friends and allies like SEAG that we're working with, particularly in the context of the U.S. Climate Alliance. And if you follow me on Twitter as a result of this, I'll consider that a huge win, because that's a great way to communicate about all these issues together. Okay, so here's what I want to touch on at a high level. First of all, I just want to make sure we all understand how are U.S. forests and forest products performing right now as a climate change solution? What are the future trends? What's the trajectory that we're on? How that might change. Then I want to shift to taking action. So what is it exactly that we need to do to at least maintain where we are and maybe even do better? And how does this align with the CCL policy agenda? Obviously a critical issue for your interest. Okay, Forest for Climate basics. Let's just do a couple of foundational principles. Number one, U.S. forests are already a climate change solution. Let me say it again. U.S. forests and forest products are already a substantial climate change solution. And it's really important to know this because that's not necessarily true of every country. And so you'll hear a lot about countries where their forests as a whole are a source of carbon. And the U.S. kind of gets caught up sometimes in that discussion. Not here. Our forests are a large net sink of carbon in ways that I'll break down for you in a moment. You want climate action that has green jobs? How much greener can you really get than a tree, after all? The forest sector today generates more than 2.5 million jobs. That's a rounded off number. And that includes, by the way, not just jobs for people out in rural communities and working with forest products, but it really importantly includes a booming job sector in urban forestry that I'm going to get back into in a little bit. Okay, this is your U.S. forest carbon sink. If you remember anything from this slide, you're a total rock star. I actually only really want you to remember the bottom part there, but just the top part so you know I'm not making this stuff up. This is the U.S. EPA greenhouse gas inventory. So this is super credible information, rock solid information that comes from great data that we have on what's happening with carbon in our forests right now. And these are the major components of the forest carbon sink, and I'm going to walk through those in a little bit. But the bottom is the key, that our forests and forest products as a whole are a net 731 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent sink here in the U.S. right now. And that's almost equivalent to almost 15% of U.S. fossil fuel emissions, CO2 emissions from fossil fuels. Per year. That's right. That's the current, thank you for great questions. That's the current annual sink. Okay, so let's break that down because there's some things in there that might surprise you. So with my time allotted, I can't walk through that in the detail that I would like, but hopefully you want to follow up on it. But a couple things that might surprise you. Number one is that working forests work for climate. Forests that are being actively managed and including that are generating forest products work for climate. And one of the reasons is that working forests are generally maintained in a kind of a sweet spot of growth and carbon uptake for forests. But also that, I speak in Twitter sometimes, hashtag wood is good to hashtag act on climate, is that wood stores carbon. So about half the weight of wood is carbon. And so that when you harvest forests and turn them into wood products, you're actually storing carbon. And here's the really cool thing. When you build buildings out of wood, where in other cases you might have used concrete and steel for that same type of construction, you don't only create a building that's storing carbon. That's part of our U.S. carbon sink right there in that building. But furthermore, it takes dramatically less energy to manufacture, say, a beam out of wood than a beam out of steel. So it's pretty amazing. The company Skanska did an analysis, and they said, well, where's the carbon footprint of our buildings? How can we reduce the carbon footprint of our buildings? And they kind of went into it focusing on the operations of those buildings, right? How much energy do they use to keep the lights on, keep people warm? They found out about half the carbon footprint of an average building goes into construction. So if they can do things like lean in on using wood instead of those higher GHG materials like steel and concrete, before they even start operating the building, there's a huge carbon savings opportunity. So that's one of the key reasons why working forests are so key here, is that they also spin off carbon storage into wood products. And then, of course, this whole what we call substitution effect, this kind of extra energy efficiency, that's a whole nother climate action kicker that isn't captured in that carbon sink as I characterized it. Okay, well, here's another one. When you heard American forests, when you heard we were going to talk about forests, I'm guessing, let me actually form the question. How many of you thought we were going to talk about urban forests today? There you go. Only got 2 hands. Thank you, by the way. Thank you for thinking of urban forests. I appreciate that very much. Well, you should be thinking of urban forests, and here's why. It's climate action squared. So this is cool. I showed it to you too quickly, so you couldn't have probably tracked on this. Urban forests. Forests and cities, and when I say forest, I mean from a street tree all the way to a larger urban forest fragment. It's almost 20% of the U.S. carbon sink. It's over 120 million metric tons of carbon capture in our urban trees and forests. Really, really substantial piece of the puzzle. But what's amazing, and this again is not captured in that climate benefit that we're characterizing with our carbon sink, is that urban forests reduce national residential energy use for heating and cooling by 7.2%. That's a lot of carbon. So when you put together the carbon capture in urban forests and this energy savings that we're getting from urban trees, this is one of the best climate investments that we can make. And by the way, it's also a climate justice investment. If we want this movement to be about equity and we want it to be about just transition, well, part of just transition is making sure that all people can weather climate change equitably. So my organization is centered on a concept of tree equity. If you look at that map on the left, that's a map of tree cover here in Washington, D.C. And what you'll see is that we currently have tree inequity here in Washington, D.C. and in every other city around the country. Wealthy neighborhoods have lots of trees, low-income neighborhoods don't. And in fact, in many ways, communities of color often have a lower tree canopy cover in ways that even transcend income. Well, in a changing climate, that has huge health implications, as you see from the map on the right, where the risk of health risks from heat track almost perfectly with those maps of tree inequality and income that you see there on the left. So if we can plant tree equity across our cities, it's not just climate action squared, but it's also climate justice. Okay, let's shift to trends and future potential. There are a lot of studies out there right now trying to come up with the wedges that we need to get all the way to our full solutions on climate change. And they're in different time frames and they're in different calibrations, and so I'm not actually going to try to wade into those for you right now. But I want to just point to 2 that are worth you looking at in more detail and following up. The Nature Conservancy on the left did an analysis of natural climate solutions for the United States in a paper in Science Advances, and I can help you find that if you have trouble finding it. The U.S. did an analysis you're probably very familiar with, the mid-century strategy for deep decarbonization. That was the 2050 Climate Action Plan that was prepared by the Obama administration after Paris, which was sort of the next thing that every country was required to do after coming up with its nationally determined commitment. And the U.S. was one of the earliest countries to get its homework in on that one. And in both instances, I'll just simplify it for you this way. In both instances, these 2 studies both found that U.S. forests have the potential to capture more than 30% of our future emissions. So more than double the sort of proportionate climate benefit that we're getting right now in terms of emissions reductions. Now, I'm oversimplifying there for a few different variables. To calculate that, partly you have to calculate how much bigger could we make this carbon sink. You also have to calculate how much do you think emissions are going to change, right? Because the percentage is actually, it's a calculation of the percent of whatever you think emissions are going to be and however big you think that carbon sink is going to be. So actually, even the metrics that these 2 papers use, for example, are different, and there are other papers that use different metrics. So for right now, for simplicity's sake, let's just go with that there is real consensus around the idea that if we make the right investments in our forests, they can actually become 30% of the emission solutions that we're looking for in terms of CO2 emissions, and that's a really substantial contribution. And this, by the way, is that Nature Conservancy paper, which is definitely well worth your read. I will tell you this is an extremely aggressive, this is what I think many people feel is a sort of a max physical potential of the land to capture more carbon. I think most people would agree there are some real feasibility questions with whether we could actually achieve all of the emissions reductions that are suggested in this paper. But it's done a really great job of putting out a kind of an outer bound that I think people feel like is a credible marker for us to bring into the conversation. And as you'll see, and this will set up some of the next things I'm going to talk about, it breaks down what we need to do in terms of practices, practice-based pathways. What action do we need people to take on the land to get a certain positive result, such as storing more carbon or reducing the amount of, in some cases, carbon that we're emitting, say, from forests. And Debbie talked about some of those practices in her presentation. Okay, so there are a couple of headwinds. So that's the possibility, but I want to really call out a couple of headwinds. When the U.S. was preparing its NDC for Paris, it looked at trends. It said, well, hey, what's the no-action alternative? We just kind of keep going the way we are. Everybody does the same thing that they're doing right now on the land. What trend are we on? And what they found is there are a couple of troubling trends. One is that we've been in an era where mostly the amount of forest we've been losing to development and the amount of forest we've been gaining in terms of, say, land that used to be farmed that's just kind of trending back into forest for one reason or another, has been about equal. But those trends are not projected to stay the same. We're projected to start losing a lot more forest land, millions and millions of acres of forest land that's currently forest, to start going into development and other non-forest uses. So if we can't keep our forests as forests, we're going to start leaking from that forest carbon sink. And here's the one that keeps me awake at night. You might have noticed that trees do many things well, but kind of moving around the landscape in response to changing climate, not so good. And this is what's happening in California as a result of trees getting out of whack with a climate that's changing before our eyes. 148 million trees in total that have died in California just since 2010. And I probably don't have to explain the carbon implications of that to all of you, but I will. So these are trends in emissions from wildfire. Yes, where there is smoke, there is carbon. And really, really serious implications, not just, you can probably track the trend there from 1990 to 2015, with 2015 being one of the two most substantial fire years in the last 50. The other second most was 2017. Another trend you can probably pick up. So that you can see, first of all, the overall trend, and then the fact that a bad fire year is a whole lot more carbon emissions than a quote-unquote normal fire year in the trends that we're in right now. So forests that are dying, and dying forests, by the way, burn more frequently, are suddenly becoming a really serious source of emissions. So we have to help our forests remain healthy in the face of a changing climate, or we lose their carbon sequestration power. And this is a piece that we did with the Washington Post based on an analysis that we had done of that kind of data from the U.S. Forest Service, showing there are actually 6 states in the western U.S. where their forests have become a source of carbon because those impacts of climate change, forest dying, forest burning, are actually overwhelming growth. So we really have to get on top of this. Our organization calls it carbon offense and carbon defense. In the old days, we used to say, how much more carbon can you give me in our forest? Now we're saying, no, that's half the story. Yeah, we want to pull more carbon into our forest, but we have to keep it there. And in some places, like Colorado, for example, our number one job is just to keep the carbon that's in our forest, just actually kind of keep them about treading water. If they were just emitting less carbon, that would actually be a win. And that's a really different way of thinking about forest carbon than a lot of people are used to. Okay, so taking action. First thing that we need to do is we need to plant and restore healthy and resilient forests. So for example, every time we plant a tree, we just planted a climate change solution. During the New Deal, we planted 3 billion of those climate change solutions. We didn't call it that back then, but we know how to plant a whole lot of trees at scale. And that U.S. climate, well, both the Nature Conservancy and the U.S. Mid-Century Strategy both call for planting millions and millions and millions of acres of forest. Those are the kinds of things that we need to do on the carbon offset side. But we also need to do things like, in some cases, burn forests more frequently so they emit a little bit of carbon at a time, but they don't have a catastrophic burn that releases lots of carbon, like that graph that I showed you, or table of results. And we have to push the horizons. If you're a soil person, you got my joke here. Push horizons, new horizons like forest soil carbon. So this might surprise you, but the single largest pool of carbon in forests is under your feet. But we've been ignoring that pool of carbon because we haven't had good data on it. The science has been a little bit confusing about what is it when we harvest forests in certain ways, when we take actions in forests, what's the impact on soil carbon? We haven't really known. So our organization is working with the U.S. Forest Service and other partners to get better data on forest soil carbon and then to figure out what are the practices that we need landowners to undertake. In some cases, for example, harvesting forests differently or reforesting more quickly after fire to do a better job with forest soil carbon. Huge opportunity there. Well, I talked about tree equity, and I would just go as far as to say from a combination of climate action and climate justice, there are a few investments that we could make as a society that we think would be more impactful, and so we're trying to launch a movement across the country to do a lot more urban forestry, which, by the way, is both tree planting, but it's also taking better care of the trees that we have in cities. And one of the exciting things about it, you want to talk about green job opportunities. You know, right now there are tens of thousands of open positions in urban forestry across the country. Meanwhile, my organization works in places like Ward 7 and 8 here in DC, where you got unemployment of 10 to 12%. There's a disconnect there. So we've launched a new initiative about a year ago to figure out how do we create a stronger ladder of opportunity for people in these underserved neighborhoods where we're doing a lot of this tree equity work into the range of urban forestry careers, both being created in their own neighborhoods and across whole cities. And again, I just feel like this is an amazing opportunity for us to diversify our movement and really speak to the needs of all people in the way that we take action on climate change. Okay, just a couple other things. Who's ready to help? The Forest Climate Working Group. This is a coalition that I was really proud to co-found 11 years ago. We launched during Cap and Trade. It represents everyone in the forest sector, private landowners at all scales, forest products companies, U.S. Forest Service, and the National Association of State Foresters. Very diverse range of nonprofit conservation organizations, academics, carbon market investors, you name it. 50 organizations in total that have been working together for 11 years to say, we're going to put ourselves out there saying, yes, climate change is real, and yes, U.S. forests can help, and here's what we need to do. So this is a group that's, we've invited CCL to our annual meetings. We've done a lot of great cross-pollination, and we're really excited to think about how we can partner with you all in making the case for taking action on climate change and making forests part of that. Thank you. So just a couple last things. Debbie already talked about the U.S. Climate Alliance, so I won't go into too much detail except to say we're extremely excited about the leadership of states. And yes, I heard somebody say it is up to 24 now, 23 states in the territory of Puerto Rico that are doing a fantastic job leading on climate change and putting land front and center in how they do that. And so these 6 NGOs, including our 2 organizations, have been coaching these states along in how to do this, taking advantage of everything we've learned. And for my organization, everything we've learned on, in particular the Forest Climate Working Group, on how do you translate the kind of approaches that I've described, the actions that we need to take in forests into policy so that our public policy is actually making more of those things happen. This is a document that we created, a policy toolkit that really maps out a very holistic approach to getting more of these practices, these activities happening in our forests through any pathway necessary. We were ready to do it through cap and trade. We've worked in different situations to conceptualize the idea of using carbon tax revenue to do this work, but we'll also do it through annual appropriations. We'll do it through changing how public lands are managed. We'll do it through technical assistance. We're we're ready to take any pathway necessary to make more of these things happen. And so I think there are a lot of opportunities without changing CCL's core approach to getting this work done to align ourselves on a holistic agenda for climate action that advances fee and dividend and yet recognizes we've got to find policy pathways to get this work done too. So excited to talk with you about that. And then finally, let's raise our voices together. You know, one thing that we've worked really hard at at American Forests and in the Forest Climate Working Group and in our partnership with the U.S. Climate Alliance and group like Debbie's is to let's tell this story. Because I know I've surprised a few people, I can tell, I've surprised a few people today with information about what land can do for climate. And when people hear this and they hear about, hey, tree equity, I can do all these fantastic things for our country on so many levels and act on climate change, that sounds like a good deal. And so telling this story together, I think, is a really powerful opportunity. And so we love to hook up on social media, and we're doing things like Washington Post letters to the editor to help make that happen. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm looking forward to question and answer.
Perfect. So amazing, right? A lot of information. There's a lot of good questions here. We have time for a few. One of them, I think, Jed, you started to deal with. You may want to weigh in. It's a really good one. It's how would a national price on carbon work hand in hand with the work of your organizations? How would it accelerate your goals? And I guess vice versa. You both want to take a stab at that.
Yeah. So from my perspective, a price on carbon is one of those beneficial incentives we can get to capture the attention of farmers and ranchers. It does cost money to actually change their practices. They undertake risk when they change their practices. Quite often they need to change their equipment, and it tends to be very expensive. So any amount to help provide a financial signal or some sort of economic benefit to help them change their practices, to get through those periods of risk when they change their practices, is incredibly beneficial. I think that's why I'm invested right now in the whole idea of ecosystem service markets, not only because it provides that signal, but also because then we can measure it and we can actually see what the impact is over time and be able to report back, if you will, not only to the farmers and ranchers, but to society as well.
Yeah, I'll briefly say that doing the things that I described is going to require a lot of money. And when we started doing this work 11 years ago in particular, cap and trade looked like it was going to create a lot of financial levers and uplift. Washington State proposed a carbon tax where they had a very substantial portion of carbon tax revenue going to the kinds of things that I've described. So we've seen a lot of different ways that climate legislation could directly finance, through a carbon pricing mechanism, could directly finance the activities I'm talking about. But it doesn't have to be that way. People often say, well, we have a declining federal budget, we can't afford it. Time out. Our federal budget's going up. It's not declining. It's going up. We're spending more money than ever on lots of things. We're just not spending more money than ever on this. So it's actually time for us to start asking for what we really need. We spend $30 million a year on tree equity in this country. We have a $5 billion Forest Service budget. We spend $30 million on planting trees in cities. If anybody thinks that's only worth $30 million, let me know. That's a lot more important for this country than that. So we have to learn to start asking for things at the level that we need them. And that money can come lots of different ways, including from the federal treasury and other mechanisms that are a little more familiar and don't necessarily hinge on a carbon price. So that's why I say we're willing to work within the context of a climate, of a carbon price, but we're also willing to say, let's complement what we're doing on a carbon price with financing the things that we need to do through other mechanisms. And the money's there, we just have to ask for it.
Okay, this one is kind of related for Debbie. How can we persuade farmers now, locally and nationally, to support HR 763? Do you know what that is? The Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Bill. So that's a big question.
I think this gets to the issue of incentives. So when I started working on climate change, my goal was to, in fact, really just get the agricultural sector comfortable with the idea of climate change as a reality. Unfortunately, time has taken over that reality. Farmers and ranchers see what's happening on the ground. They can tell you things are changing in ways that are not beneficial to them, number one. They see what's happening. Number two, they have companies saying to them, I need to reduce my greenhouse gas footprint. I need to do it within my ag supply chain. How are you going to do that? That's where it gets to the tools. So whether it's this legislation or other legislation, we have to find ways to communicate with the sector in ways that help them meet their needs as well, right? They're farming and ranching first and foremost. How do we make them farm and ranch in ways that benefit them and benefit us? That's where it becomes really important for the tools that we provide to them. So whether it's equipment or technology or financial incentives to change their practices, we have to do that. It's the only way we're going to do this at the speed and the scale that we require. So I urge you to think about how we work together with our compatriots on the ground, the farmers and ranchers, and provide the tools they need. We need to make it easy. We need to allow them to continue to farm and ranch and do it in ways that meet all of our collective needs. They have the same pain points we have right now. We just have to figure out how to leverage that and work with them.
There's a couple of basic questions here. First, I don't know, because the questions come up, I think they're important. I don't know if either or both of you want to answer them, but one is just simply, how do we put carbon back into the soil? And then another one is, how do we sequester carbon in soil? So that's kind of a very basic question.
I can take that one. So the way carbon is lost from soils is typically from tillage or actually disturbing the soil. So anything that prevents disturbance of soil tends to not only help it remain in the soil, but for instance, conventional tillage, where you draw a plow through the soil, that turns the soil over, it exposes the carbon to air, and then it's lost to the atmosphere. So changing to like no-till or away from conventional tillage and to no-till is one significant way to do that. The other way is to ensure that the ground is always covered. So cover crops, you hear a lot more about cover crops. That's literally preventing your soils from being bare, because bare soils erode from rain and wind. They're also subject to just heat, for instance, can cause that top layer of the soil to warm up. The carbon is lost. So covering the soil. Cover crops also, when it rains, if you have a cover crop on your soil, it prevents the soil from eroding away. Those are two big ways to do that. The other way, though, is if you think about how does carbon actually get physically into the soil? It's through photosynthesis. Plants absorb the carbon goes down into the roots. So whether you harvest the top, if you will, what's above ground or not, it's the roots that remained in the soil that really help to get the carbon into the soil. So plants with deeper, more permanent root systems are one way to get into the soil. And by not tilling it, you don't disturb it, those roots remain in there. And when they disintegrate or decompose, the carbon remains in the soil. So those are the major ways to think about it. Keep the soil covered, try not to disturb it.
And just the one quickie from me, and this is actually a paper that we worked with the U.S. Forest Service on, and I just retweeted it today, shameless plug, just follow me and you'll find it, but found that reforestation has a much bigger carbon impact than realized in the soil, and particularly how you go about doing it, when you do it, how quickly after a disturbance, for example. There's a real delta there for us to capture around reforestation and forest soil carbon. There's a lot more I could say about forests and soil carbon, but that's a particularly neat one to zero in on.
Unfortunately, this is going to have to be our last question. And I'm going to ask this because it came up in the ag exemption and military exemption breakout session yesterday. There was a little bit of discussion about ethanol and the consequences of higher fuel prices on ethanol, which farmers in the Midwest rely on for income. But it's not about ethanol, but it's about biofuels. And do you think it's possible for biofuels, probably for you, Jad, from forests to play a role as a renewable energy resource without causing more deforestation or causing unmanageable emissions?
I'm going to give you one of my brief answers, 2 words: it depends. And that's a frustrating answer for a lot of folks on this issue, where everyone has wanted, it feels like, or lots of folks have wanted an absolute answer. And with the time we have allotted, I will just say it absolutely depends. It's very situational, but there's absolutely no question that there are situations where we can use some portion of forest biomass that's being grown and harvested in forests as a source of energy, and that's an absolute carbon winner. And so our job is to find those situations where it's a winner for carbon, it's a winner for forest health, it's a winner for economies, and to move forward in those areas. And where we're in situations where it isn't a good mix, to have the discipline to recognize that.
Thank you. We're going to have to stop. I also, I want to thank Debbie and Jad, but I also want to thank Madeline, who saved us. You know, so a hand for Madeline. And thank you all for coming, and stay in touch.